5 signs God has given you over. Romans 1:28. This is not a message most people want to hear, not because it is complicated, but because it is uncomfortable, because it confronts something deeper than behavior. It confronts direction. It confronts the possibility that something has already shifted, and you didn't recognize it when it happened. You didn't wake up one day and decide to walk away. You didn't make a clear, visible decision. It was slower than that, quieter than that, and that is exactly why it is so dangerous. There are moments when God corrects you. There are moments when He interrupts you, when something inside you resists what you are doing. You feel it. You pause. You question yourself. That is not rejection. That is involvement. That is presence. But there are other moments when that resistance is no longer there, when that interruption stops, when nothing inside you pushes back anymore. And instead of feeling alarmed, you feel normal. Romans 1:28 speaks about a moment most people misunderstand. It does not describe sudden punishment. It describes a process, a progression, a point where God allows a person to continue in a direction they have repeatedly chosen, not because He stopped seeing them, but because they stopped responding to Him. And eventually, what was once resisted becomes accepted. What was once corrected becomes permitted. And the most unsettling part is this: when that shift happens, it does not feel like judgment. It feels like freedom. It feels like things got easier, like the tension disappeared, like the struggle is gone. You are no longer being interrupted. You are no longer being challenged in the same way. And because of that, you assume things are fine. You assume you are growing. You assume you are moving forward. But what if the ease you feel is not progress, but permission? Because when God gives someone over, He does not always announce it. He allows it. He allows the path you insist on. He allows the choices you justify. He allows the mindset you protect. And over time, you stop noticing what used to matter. You stop questioning what used to concern you. You stop feeling what once made you pause, not because you became stronger, but because you became less sensitive. This is where many people get lost, not in rebellion, but in comfort, not in defiance, but in quiet acceptance. They continue their life. They continue their routine. They continue their belief that everything is still aligned, but something inside them is no longer responding the same way, and they don't stop long enough to ask why. Listen carefully. This message is not here to condemn you. It is here to wake you up, because if you can recognize these signs, then something inside you is still aware. And if you are still aware, then this is not the end of your story. But you have to be honest, because the signs you are about to hear are not obvious. They are internal, they are subtle, and most people ignore them until they are too far to easily turn back. And the first sign begins in a place most people never question. There was a time when something inside you reacted immediately. You didn't need someone to explain it to you. You didn't need a warning. You didn't need a consequence. You felt it, a quiet resistance, a weight that didn't let you move forward the same way. Not fear, not shame, but awareness. A sense that something was not aligned with who you were becoming. That feeling didn't push you away. It pulled you back. It made you pause. It made you think. It made you reconsider. That was not pressure. That was presence. That was God still interacting with you in a way that kept you sensitive and awake. But now, something is different. You notice it, even if you don't want to admit it clearly. Things that once would have stopped you no longer stop you. Thoughts that once would have made you uncomfortable now pass without resistance. You still know what is right. You still understand what matters, but you don't feel it the same way anymore. And that is where the shift begins. Not when you stop believing, not when you walk away completely, but when what once moved you no longer moves you the same way. At first, it feels like growth. It feels like control, like you are no longer affected so easily, like you became stronger, more stable, more balanced. You tell yourself that you matured, that you are no longer overreacting, that you are not as sensitive as before. But what if that sensitivity was never weakness? What if it was awareness? What if it was the very thing that kept you from drifting too far without noticing? Because when God is close, your spirit is alive. It responds. It reacts. It recognizes misalignment even before it becomes visible. But when that sensitivity fades, it does not always feel like loss. It can feel like relief, like things got easier, like the tension disappeared. But what if that tension was never the problem? What if it was protection? What if it was the signal that something inside you was still connected enough to recognize when something was off? The absence of conviction is not freedom, it is exposure. You can move without resistance. You can justify what you once questioned. You can continue without interruption. And that is exactly what makes it dangerous. Not because something is forcing you away, but because nothing is stopping you anymore. And when nothing inside you pushes back, you don't feel distant. You feel normal. And that is how distance becomes invisible. Most people do not notice this shift when it begins. They notice it when it's already deep. When the gap between who they were and who they have become is no longer small. When what once mattered feels far away. When they look back and realize they crossed lines they once said they never would. Not in a moment of rebellion, but in a series of quiet decisions that were never interrupted. Pay attention to what no longer bothers you. Pay attention to what no longer creates tension inside you. Because sometimes the clearest sign that something has changed is not what you feel, but what you stopped feeling. And if you are no longer being corrected internally, if nothing is confronting you anymore, if everything feels easy in places that once required awareness, then you need to stop and ask yourself something deeper. Not what you're doing, but what inside you stopped responding. Because when conviction fades, it is not always because you moved forward. Sometimes it is because something stopped reaching you the same way. And if that has happened, then something deeper is already shifting, whether you recognize it or not. You tell yourself, nothing is wrong. Not out loud, not directly, but through the way you continue moving without questioning anything deeper. You still believe. You still pray sometimes. You still think of yourself as someone who is connected. And because of that, you assume everything is still in place. But the most dangerous place a person can be is not far from God. It is believing they are close when something inside has already shifted. There is a quiet deception in thinking you are fine simply because nothing is obviously broken. No crisis, no collapse, no moment that forces you to stop. Everything looks stable on the surface, so you keep going. But stability is not always alignment. Sometimes it is just the absence of interruption. Sometimes It is just the result of not looking closely enough at what is really happening inside you. You used to examine yourself more carefully. You used to question your motives. You used to pause and reflect on your direction. But now that process has become less frequent. Not because you decided to ignore it, but because it no longer feels necessary. You feel steady. You feel okay. And that feeling slowly replaces the need to go deeper. You stop checking the condition of your heart because nothing is forcing you to. This is how distance hides itself. It does not announce its presence. It blends into normal life. It allows you to continue without urgency. It allows you to believe that what you are experiencing is still the same as what you once had. But over time, something essential is no longer active the same way. Not gone completely, but reduced, weakened, less present. And because the change was gradual, you never stopped long enough to recognize it clearly. There is a difference between being at peace and being comfortable. Peace comes with awareness. It keeps you alert. It keeps you sensitive. Comfort, when it replaces awareness, can make you passive. It can make you stop paying attention. It can make you accept things you once questioned. And when that happens, you don't feel lost. You feel settled. And that is what makes it so difficult to detect. You have to be willing to ask yourself questions you may not want to answer. Not based on what you believe, but based on what is actually happening inside you. Are you still sensitive to what matters? Or have you grown used to not noticing? Are you still aware of your direction? Or are you simply continuing because nothing is stopping you? Are you still engaged internally? Or are you just maintaining what you once had without checking if it is still alive? Because the truth is, you can look the same on the outside and be completely different on the inside. You can continue your routine and still be drifting. You can still call yourself close to God and yet be moving in a direction you have not fully examined, not because you rejected Him, but because you stopped evaluating where you actually stand. And if you keep assuming everything is fine without ever questioning it, then you may already be further than you think. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but enough that if you were honest, you would realize something is not where it used to be. There was a time when you drew clear lines, not because you were perfect, but because something inside you refused to blur what mattered. You knew where you stood. You knew what you would not accept. You didn't need someone to convince you. There was an internal clarity that made certain choices feel impossible to ignore. You resisted things not because someone told you to, but because you recognized that crossing certain lines would change something inside you. But now, those same lines are not as clear. You don't cross them suddenly. You move them slowly. You adjust them in small ways that seem reasonable in the moment. You don't tell yourself that you're doing something wrong. You explain it. You frame it differently. You give it context. You make it make sense. And the more you explain it, the less resistance you feel, not because it became right, but because you became comfortable with it. Justification is subtle. It does not feel like rebellion. It feels like logic. It feels like maturity. It feels like understanding the situation better. You tell yourself that things are not as simple as they once seemed, that life is more complex, that you are just seeing things from a broader perspective now. But what if that broader perspective is not clarity? What if it is distance disguised as reasoning? Because when God is actively correcting you, you do not need to convince yourself. You feel the truth before you explain it, but when that correction fades, your mind becomes louder than your awareness. You start building explanations to replace what you no longer feel. You construct reasoning where conviction used to be, and over time, those explanations become stronger than the voice that once guided you. This is how boundaries dissolve without being noticed. Not through one decision, but through a series of small approvals. Small compromises that feel harmless at first. Small shifts that seem insignificant, but each one moves you slightly further from what you once recognized as aligned. And because each step feels small, you never stop to see how far you have actually moved. You begin to defend what you once questioned. You begin to normalize what once felt uncomfortable. You begin to accept what once required caution. And eventually, you no longer see the difference between where you started and where you are now. Not because there is no difference, but because you adapted to it. And the more you justify, the less you reflect. Because reflection creates tension, and justification removes it. Reflection forces you to look deeper, to confront what is real. Justification allows you to move forward without stopping. And when you choose to move forward without stopping long enough to evaluate, you are no longer being guided by awareness. You are being carried by your own reasoning. Pay attention to the things you have explained away. Pay attention to the areas where you no longer feel the need to question yourself. Because sometimes the clearest sign that something has shifted is not what you're doing, but how easily you defend it, how quickly you remove doubt, how naturally you replace awareness with explanation. You are not meant to live guided by what feels easiest to justify. You are meant to live guided by what remains true even when it challenges you. And if you no longer feel challenged, if everything in your life feels easy to explain and comfortable to accept, then something deeper has already changed. Not in your actions first, but in your sensitivity to what those actions mean. There was a time when certain things carried weight, not because someone placed that weight on you, but because you recognized it yourself. You understood that some choices mattered more than others. You felt the difference between what aligned with your spirit and what pulled you away from it. That awareness created a kind of gravity inside you. It made certain decisions feel heavier, more significant, more real. You could not move through them carelessly because something inside you would not allow it. But now, that weight is not the same. Things that once felt serious now feel lighter, not in a freeing way, but in a way that removes their impact. You can move through decisions without that same pause, without that same awareness that something meaningful is at stake. You still know intellectually that certain things matter, but you don't feel it the same way. And when you stop feeling the weight of something, you begin to treat it as if it does not carry consequences. This is not about fear. It is not about living under pressure. It is about awareness. When something matters, you feel it. You approach it differently. You give it attention. You respect its impact. But when that sense of weight disappears, you begin to handle important things the same way you handle everything else, quickly, casually, without reflection. And over time, that way of moving begins to define your entire direction. The loss of weight leads to the loss of caution. You stop guarding what once needed to be protected. You stop paying attention to details that once made a difference. You stop slowing down in moments that required awareness. And because nothing feels heavy enough to demand your focus, everything begins to blend together. What once stood out as important now feels equal to everything else. And that is where something deeper begins to slip. Because when everything feels the same, nothing feels significant. And when nothing feels significant, you stop recognizing what is actually shaping your life. You move forward without understanding what you are building. You make decisions without realizing their direction. You continue without considering what is being formed inside you over time. You were not designed to move through life without weight. You were meant to recognize when something requires attention, when something requires care, when something requires you to stop and consider what it means. But when that ability fades, you begin to live without that internal signal. And without that signal, you no longer know when something deserves more from you. Pay attention to what feels light that once felt heavy. Pay attention to what no longer slows you down. Because sometimes the clearest sign that something has shifted is not what you are doing, but how little it affects you, how easily you move through it, how quickly you leave it behind without reflection. If nothing carries weight anymore, then nothing is grounding you. And when nothing grounds you, you can drift without even realizing it. There was a time when certain words reached you immediately, not just with understanding, but with impact. You could hear something simple and feel it deeply. It would stay with you. It would follow you. It would challenge you long after the moment passed. You didn't just process it, you absorbed it. There was a responsiveness inside you that made truth feel alive, not distant. It did not matter how it came, it mattered that it reached you. But now, that response is not the same. You still hear, you still understand, you still recognize what is being said, but it does not go as deep. It does not stay as long. It does not affect you the way it once did. You can listen, agree, even appreciate it, and still move on unchanged. Not because the truth lost its power, but because something in you is no longer receiving it the same way. This is where something critical begins to shift. Because hearing is not the same as receiving. You can be surrounded by truth and still remain untouched by it. You can be exposed to the same words, the same message, the same direction, and yet nothing inside you moves, not because you rejected it, but because it no longer penetrates. It stays on the surface. It passes through your mind, but it does not settle in your spirit. And when that happens consistently, something begins to close. Not suddenly, not completely, but gradually. You become less affected by what once shaped you, less influenced by what once guided you, less aware of what once corrected you. And over time, that lack of response becomes normal. You no longer expect to be moved. You no longer expect to be confronted. You no longer expect something inside you to shift when truth is present. That is not growth. That is distance. Because when God is actively engaging with you, His words do not remain external. They enter, they press, they stay. They create movement inside you that you cannot ignore. But when that engagement is no longer active in the same way, you begin to hear without being changed. You begin to listen without being affected. And that is one of the clearest signs something has shifted. You are not resisting. You are not rejecting. You are simply not responding. And that lack of response can continue for a long time without being questioned. Because nothing feels wrong enough to confront. Nothing forces you to stop. Nothing interrupts your direction. You continue hearing but you stop receiving. You continue listening, but you stop absorbing. Pay attention to what no longer reaches you. Pay attention to what you can hear without feeling anything inside. Because when truth no longer creates movement in you, it does not mean it lost its power. It may mean you lost your sensitivity to it. And when sensitivity fades, direction becomes harder to recognize. Not because the path disappeared, but because you are no longer responding to what is trying to guide you. If you recognize yourself in these signs, do not turn away from it. Do not rush to dismiss it. Stay with it long enough to be honest. Not about what you say you believe, not about what you show on the outside, but about what is actually happening inside you. Because this moment, right here, is more important than anything you have been avoiding. This is where awareness returns, or where it is ignored again. God giving someone over is not a sudden event. It is the result of a direction repeated long enough that it becomes accepted. It is what happens when correction is resisted so many times that silence replaces it. Not because God stopped seeing you, but because you stopped responding to Him. And over time, that lack of response becomes your normal state. Not forced, not dramatic, just quietly established. But this is where you need to understand something clearly. The fact that you can recognize these signs means something is still alive inside you. You would not question this if everything was completely closed. You would not feel this tension if nothing inside you was still aware. You would not stop and listen if something deeper was not still responding. That awareness you feel right now is not random. It is not coincidence. It is the evidence that you are not as far as you could be. But awareness alone is not enough. Because you can see clearly and still choose to do nothing. You can understand what is happening and still continue the same way, and that is where the real decision begins. Not in what you feel, but in what you choose next. Quietly, internally, without announcement, without performance. You do not fix this by trying to feel something again. You do not fix this by forcing emotion, by saying more words, by pretending something changed. You begin by paying attention again. You begin by becoming sensitive again to what you have been ignoring. You begin by removing the things you justified, by questioning the things you stopped questioning, by slowing down in the places where you started moving without awareness. This is not about doing more, it is about seeing clearly again, because what was lost was not access. It was attention, it was sensitivity, it was the ability to recognize when something inside you was being corrected. And if that can be restored, then direction can be restored too. Not instantly, but intentionally. Do not wait for a feeling to tell you something changed. Feelings follow direction, not the other way around. If you begin to realign what you have allowed to drift, if you begin to confront what you became comfortable with, if you begin to listen again instead of just hearing, then something inside you will start to respond again. Slowly, quietly, but real. You are not being pushed away, but you may have moved without noticing. And if you are hearing this now, if something inside you is paying attention, then you are not beyond return. But you are also not where you thought you were. And that truth is not meant to discourage you. It is meant to wake you up before distance becomes something you no longer question. This is where it changes. Not in a moment everyone sees, but in a decision only you can make.